All right, everyone. Thank you for staying for our last section and our conference here today. And at this time, we have the privilege of hearing from Alicia Tucker. And she works with our constitutional studies programs here and teaches, like me, American Heritage. So go American Heritage. I mean, I like it. But Alicia has specialized in the ideals of liberty, articulated by the American Revolution and the inherent freedoms protected by the religion clauses of the First Amendment, including their influence on freedom around the world. And I'm reading the title of her words today, and I went over these titles with my students, and this was one that actually a lot of my I teach a Indian law class, and so they were really interested in this because we really look at the Constitution. We study our Indian law class, so they're really excited to be here, but they had to go to work. So I'm glad you all stayed. I'm glad for you attending on camera that you're watching. But let's give a round of applause for our speaker, Alicia Tucker.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be part of the Healing Conversations workshop yesterday, and then also today the J. Ritchie Ritchie Bonner conference today. I just feel so privileged and have learned so much about the practice of peace building and how it's not just a particular discipline, it's something that we can incorporate into our lives and within our communities. So my lens that I do in the Center for Constitutional Studies, in addition to working with students here at UVU teaching American Heritage, I mostly work with history teachers that are teaching history and civics. So with the responsibility to teach about social studies to mostly like middle schoolers to high schoolers, and so helping them teach about our shared tradition and then also bring in different diverse perspectives at the same time. So I was asked to talk about conflict resolution among the American founders. So my first thought was to talk about the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, because they became huge enemies after the campaign of 1800, and then at the end of their lives, they reconciled and became friends again. So the campaign of 1800 was when political parties were first emerging, and there's a lot of really nasty campaigning going on. So we think that our campaigns today have a lot of contempt. This was really like the first contempt-filled campaign. Because before that, it was just George Washington and everybody loved him and just thought he should be the president, and there wasn't much of a campaign around it. So for some context over that campaigning, Jefferson's supporter, who was James Callender, who was a pamphleteer, he claimed that Adams was a hermaphrodite, and while Adams' people said that Jefferson would openly promote prostitution, incest, and adultery. And there's a lot other of these kinds of accusations happening. So by the end of their lives, Adams is 90 and Jefferson is 83, about a year before, that's when they die. So about a year before they renew this friendship through correspondence. And so they start talking with each other about their memories, and so much that they feel this connection that they end up dying on the same day, and that John Adams, when he's like about to take his last breath, he says, "Jefferson lives," but he doesn't know that Jefferson is dying on the same day. So I thought that was a good story of, connecting to political campaigning, but this personal connection. But I chose to talk about building consensus around the issue of slavery in the Constitutional Convention, because that has a much more broader impact on our society. And if you're interested in going into peace building, around the world, or even, in our communities around the nation, understanding the context of, the original sin within our Constitution can help to provide context for work today. So I chose to focus on that, but not in there. We're going to have a brief foray into talking about Abraham Lincoln's approach for reconciliation at the end of the Civil War, and how it was this great approach and would have been amazing if it continued, but then things changed, and we'll talk briefly about that. So first, some of my key points to talk about in thinking about how I talked to teachers about this, or how you learned about slavery at the time of the Constitutional Convention from your teachers. There's not a lot of context around what was slavery happening in the country coming into the Constitutional Convention. So we often think of like, oh darn, if only at that moment they ended slavery, then our country would have been so much better. So my hope is to help communicate what was the historical context and the attitudes around slavery for the delegates going into the convention, and how it wasn't really possible at the national level to end slavery. So it was a great achievement to create a consensus, to be able to create a constitution that was part of their union. That created the union that we have. So that's going to be some context, and then and like what was possible in order for it. So a big part that's kind of new for teaching, not new history, this is known to historians, but not really known to history teachers, is about this gradual emancipation movement that's happening ahead of the Constitutional Convention. So that's kind of the insight that I'm hoping to share, and I was kind of hoping teachers from yesterday would be here too to learn about this, and how that's going to help you understand more of that context of the possibilities of ending slavery, what was happening in part of the country, and how that impacted the decisions made in the Constitutional Convention. So my first point is I just want to help us understand that going into the Constitutional Convention, that the states are really important. That right now we think of ourselves first as an American, and like I grew up in Florida. If you ask me like what's my identity politically, I'd be like, I'm an American. You know, I wouldn't say, I mean, I do identify as a Floridian, but it's like definitely like secondary. And now I'm like becoming a Utahan, and so that's like another secondary thing. So, but the thing to note about the states at this time is ahead of the National Congress writing the Declaration with the Committee of Five and Jefferson writing the Declaration, that several states have already made their own declarations, and they've already started writing their state constitutions. So they South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and New Jersey are all doing this work, and they're like ahead of the National Congress. And other states are starting to do the same thing. So people are starting to accept separation from England, from the crown. But the main point I want to say is that with these state constitutions, they're very proud of them because they didn't have the rights protections they had the tradition of the rights of Englishmen, but under the Magna Carta, it was only for the barons, a few landowners, and it was about their relationship with the king. And then for the Bill of Rights in 1689, it's about the rights of members of Parliament. So and the British Constitution is not a written document. It is a body of law that's a tradition that includes Supreme Court decisions. So it's kind of more of this constitutional tradition and not really a document that they can point to. So when the Americans feel like their rights are being violated, they don't have anything to point to. So when they create their state constitutions, they're really proud of it because each of the state constitutions have a place where they can point to and say, this is where my rights are protected, and that if there's any kind of government violation against them, that I have a place to stand on legally. So their connection to their states, they're very proud of their government, and that each of the states are kind of like their own mini country. So when they're coming together to create some kind of national connection, it's really not to form a national identity. The only people that really have a national American identity right now, leading into the Constitutional Convention, are those who fought in the Continental Army. because they were part of going from state to state, and they're part of this continental body that's led by a general. But everybody else who isn't really part of the Continental Army, they're really loyal to their state first. So that influences the dynamics of what's happening when they come into the Constitutional Convention. So also, another idea that I want to make sure that we establish is the sense of uncertainty and instability at the end of the war. So it's really amazing that they were able to come together and create some kind of agreement that united the states. So the part of the instability included that they're highly in debt. It's really expensive to conduct war. So after victory is declared, the Siege of Yorktown, which is the last major battle, is 1781, and then the peace treaty isn't signed until 1783. And in that process, Brian mentioned earlier about the perspective from the English perspective, that they just decided this is really expensive, a lot of people are dying, it's unpopular at home, we don't really care because all of our money is coming from the Caribbean for the most part, so we'll just let them let them go off and be their own thing, because they're probably going to fall apart soon anyway, and we'll just swoop in like 10 years was kind of the thinking around it. So that's why it's kind of like a moment in a paragraph in their, and the British Empire has done a lot of things around the world to talk about in their textbooks. There's a lot of uncertainty. States are starting to fight with each other, and there's border disputes, especially between Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And then also part of the treaty was that you have to treat loyalists respectfully. The loyalists were those who didn't fight on the side of the Americans. They stayed loyal to the crown, but Americans didn't uphold that, especially in the South. It was a very the war in the South was a lot like a civil war, where brother fought against brother very often. And so when the loyalists it's the end of the war, then a lot of times their land was just confiscated. They're just no one to stop them. They know that they're on the losing side, and then they were just kicked off their land. And so that was part of the treaty, that they shouldn't do that, but Congress didn't have the power to enforce it. And then lastly, Congress didn't have any money because the states were supposed to pay taxes, but Congress didn't have any power to enforce them to pay taxes. So there's a lot of issues, and their victory is very fragile, and the future is very uncertain. So that's more context leading into what will be the Constitutional Convention. So this is, there's a few meetings that happen to try to solve these problems. The most noteworthy one is in Annapolis in September 1786. So the Constitutional Convention happens in September of 1787. So the year before, a few states get together. They're trying to solve some problems, and including some problems over trade. And Hamilton is part of it. And Hamilton is a big thinker. And he's saying, do you really think that we should get together every so often to solve all these local problems? Wouldn't it be better if we just had a Congress that can do the things that we want them to do? And so these delegates who attended this meeting was like, yeah, let's do that. And so they said, okay, in a year from now, we're going to have a big meeting in Philadelphia. We're going to have each of the states come, and we're going to really solve these problems. And so in Hamilton's report, which he circulates to others, he says that it's dictated by anxiety for the welfare of the United States. So Washington is the hero of the Revolution, and at this time, he has made this big grand gesture and has resigned his commission as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So I like to use this image. This is if you've been in the U.S. Capitol. This is one of the large portraits. We actually saw this in the background when during the most recent, when Trump was giving his second inaugural. So this is from John Trumbull. He's was one of the main artists of the Revolutionary period. And the way that he drew this was that the cloak draped on the chair behind him is supposed to represent a throne. And at the time, many people wanted Washington to be king, but instead he turned his back on being king, and he's handing over his commission to Congress. And so ahead of this happening, so he's been telling everyone he's going to do this. It's in the tradition of Cincinnatus, who was a classical figure in Roman history, in that if you were an educated man at this time, you knew the story of Cincinnatus, that he was a general, and at a time when there was a crisis in Rome, the way the government was structured in Rome, the Senate was really good at deliberating, but they weren't very good at making really quick, fast decisions. So they had this mechanism where they could turn power over to one person who could help lead them through the crisis, and then and they could potentially continue as the dictator. So Cincinnatus, after the end of the crisis, he turns power back over to the Senate and then retires to his farm. So Cincinnatus is this model of civic virtue for revolutionary Americans. So when Washington resigns, it's referencing Cincinnatus. So he comes to be known as the American Cincinnatus, and he makes a speech about it, drawing on this tradition, and then he's like, I'm completely resigning from public office, and now I'm retiring to my farm. So when Hamilton is trying to get him to come back to public life and come to what would become the Constitutional Convention, he at first says, no, I've made this like big gesture, everybody knows, I'm the American Cincinnatus now. And so it's kind of undoing everything I did if I just came back. And so, but as we know, he eventually is persuaded. So he's persuaded because James Madison, who is a Virginian, Hamilton convinces Madison to influence Washington through asking his opinion about the upcoming meeting. And through asking his opinion so much, he eventually persuades him or tempts him into actually joining the meeting. So that's how we got Washington there. So this is one of the main points of today. So if you're kind of going in and out of paying attention, this is one of the main points to catch. So all of that is context, and we're going to get to a little more context about slavery. So this is a very unlikely meeting. The future is uncertain. There's a lot of anxiety. So when the delegates are coming to the Constitutional Convention, and they're coming because they get word that Washington's going to be there, there's several fears that they have. The first main fear is that they've now created a republic. It has a lot of issues because they haven't figured things out, but in their history, they have no examples of a republic that lasted. They've all failed. So they're worried about that. They're also worried about representation, which to us does not seem like a big deal because it's just like how you vote in Congress. But to them, it was the most important issue, because they were worried about if you change the way that you vote, then some states could eventually be more powerful than other states, and their voice and power in government would be diluted. So that was another issue. And then secondly, after representation, was the issue of slavery. And I'm going to give a little more context of why slavery was so important for this time. So, and this is the part, if you're for a history teacher, that they don't really know about and would really help add understanding to understanding the issue of slavery at the beginning of our country. So in Pennsylvania, the Constitutional Convention is in 1787. In 1780, 7 years before the Constitutional Convention, Pennsylvania passes the Gradual Emancipation Act. And so what this meant was that any enslaved baby born after 1780, when they reached 21 years old, 28 years old, each state does different ages when this gets copied, but 28 years old, then they are free. So if you were born the year before, 1780, unfortunately, you're still enslaved for the rest of your life. But this is the first Emancipation Act that's happening in the States. So the way that they're implementing this is that you have to register every child born into slavery, and they also make a registry of all of your enslaved human property every year. So they have government records of your human property. So, and then it also made it illegal to purchase slaves, newly purchased slaves within Pennsylvania. And then another thing that it banned non-residents from Pennsylvania from keeping their slaves in the state, longer than 6 months. So if you're visiting Pennsylvania, then if you want to keep your slaves, then they have to rotate or every 6 months. So Washington, a few years after this, he writes to a colleague about this idea of gradual emancipation. He says that he hopes to see some plan adopted in Virginia by the Virginia legislature by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. But what's interesting about this, so he's kind of starting to think about this idea of gradual emancipation. But when he becomes president in 1789, the first year is in New York, the capital, the seat of government, to start off as in New York. Then it goes to Philadelphia. So Philadelphia has this 6-month rule. Even though in the past, he's mentioned a few years before, he'd like to see this gradual emancipation, he quietly rotates his slaves when he's president. He doesn't want people to know that he's doing this, but he makes sure that they make trips back to Mount Vernon, so their clock of 6 months restarts every time. So that's kind of showing the contradiction around the practice of slavery this time. So this law is amended 8 years later to stop people from taking a pregnant enslaved woman across state lines to birth her baby so that it would be born into slavery. So they pass an amendment to stop that. And then also, the amendment also prohibited transporting, or also amended in 1788 to immediately free the enslaved held by people becoming permanent residents of Pennsylvania. So before the law was you couldn't purchase a new slave. Now you can't even bring your slave to Pennsylvania if you are going to permanently live there. So this is the start of this gradual emancipation movement. But I wanted to add some context to how people were thinking about slavery with the experience of Benjamin Franklin. So we all know who Benjamin Franklin is. I shouldn't presume, especially after the last session I'm influenced by. So Franklin is an innovative revolutionary. And he also has a printing business. So in 1749, we have records that he purchases enslaved people and makes them work in his printing shop. So, and then a few years later, he wrote a lot of things. In part to drive traffic to his printing business, but also because he just had a lot to say and a lot to share. So he writes observations concerning the increase of mankind of peopling of countries. So in this, he focused on the impact of holding slaves had on white families. So he thought it made the white children of the household despise work and made them idle. So this is how he's starting to think about slavery. So this person who is, we uphold as a revolutionary and is in this state that's starting, in a few years is going to make these changes. But he's not even, his introduction to practicing slavery is thinking more about the experience of the family, the impact on the family. So he's not thinking about the experience of the enslaved person at all. So in 1759, he starts to support a school that is providing education for white children, and then also the same school is also doing this separate education for free black children and also enslaved children. So he goes and he visits the school, and then he writes about this later, that he observed that they made considerable progress in reading for the time that they had respectively been in school. He also remarked that they learned as quickly as the white children, and that he didn't see any difference intellectually between the two groups. This was a radical idea even among some opponents of slavery. The overwhelmingly accepted opinion of the time was that African Americans were without a doubt possessing of fewer qualities of character and intellect than whites. Over time, Franklin started to view the negative characteristics he saw in enslaved people as the product of the negative environments and experiences of slavery rather than their natural traits. And so I want to emphasize that this is really revolutionary thinking. He's on the very frontier of this when everybody else is still accepting slavery as the norm and what they're taking for granted in society. So he's just starting to think about this. And then also some of the context for Pennsylvania is that it's settled by Quakers, and Quakers have a tradition of this idea of equality among men and women and all races. So it's not surprising that the first state that introduced gradual emancipation or any kind of emancipation is within Pennsylvania. So even living in Pennsylvania and being a leader, that he is just starting to have these thoughts. And so it's not surprising. So this is, he writes about this in 1761. In 1775 is the first abolitionist society. It's the first abolitionist group that is founded in America, and it's in Philadelphia in 1775, led by Quakers and including Benjamin Franklin. So this is just kind of showing the revolutionary changes and how it is that slavery has been practiced for 150 years in the American colonies leading up to this, and how this is just beginning to be the changes. But everybody else, and for the most part in other states, are not in the same place where Franklin is starting to be. So for more context about slavery leading into the Constitutional Convention, so we have Pennsylvania has started this gradual emancipation. Massachusetts interprets has a Supreme Court justice or a Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice, interprets the new state constitution, which was written by John Adams. It goes through several phases because in Massachusetts, they have this strong town hall tradition where everybody has a voice. So they go through lots of drafts. Eventually in 1780, Massachusetts adopts its constitution. And then the next year is one of the first cases in which the new constitution is used to interpret that slavery should be illegal because it has this universal language about this idea of equality. So slavery ends in Massachusetts. And then other northern states also start to follow the pattern of Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation. I forgot to mention that the gradual emancipation was kind of a deference to enslavers to say, we're not going to end everything immediately, that we would worry about that being too disruptive. You have 20 years to plan, that you're not going to have your enslaved laborers, in 28 years. So other northern states, recognize this strategy and they start copying it. So Connecticut and Rhode Island adopt a similar gradual emancipation in 1784, and then that's before the Constitutional Convention. Then after the Constitutional Convention in 1799, New York adopts something similar, and then also New Jersey in 1804 adopts something similar. And then another thing that's happening with slavery ahead of the Constitutional Convention is that the Northwest Territory, several of the states have Western land claims, and they give up their land claims to Congress to govern it or to decide how to govern it. And so part of deciding how to govern it, in 1784, there was a proposal drafted by Thomas Jefferson that does not get adopted. But including in this Northwest Ordinance of 1784 that didn't pass was that there would be no slavery, and the main question it was addressing was how would these Western states, or how would this Western the territory be governed? And they decided that they would first be territories, and that once 20,000 people settled this area, then they could apply to become a state, and then that state would be equal to the original states, which was like normal to us now, but like that was a big idea. That instead of just continuing to expand the borders like an empire that they knew was really common, now they're going to create states that then would have an equal voice with the other states. And then so when Jefferson drafted this, in addition to saying that there wouldn't be slavery, he said, in all of this territory, any states that we create in the West, not just for the Northwest Territory that we're talking about here, slavery is illegal. And so that did not get adopted. But a few years later, in 1787, then the Northwest Ordinance is adopted. And so instead of saying no slavery in the Western states, it just says no slavery in the Northwest Territory. And at the same time, there's included a fugitive slave clause, meaning that if your enslaved human property escapes, then you're able to hire a bounty hunter to go hunt them down, trap them, and drag them back to your place of enslavement and force them to continue to work. So compare this to, so this is in 1787. Earlier in 1772, there's a Supreme Court case in England known as the Somerset case, which outlaws slavery on British soil, not within the colonies, but on British soil. So there was an enslaver who purchased a slave in Virginia, brings him to England, and then they said, well, because he came to British soil, then he's free. So this is in the background of, well, do we want that to be what we do here? And so that's part of why the provision was included if we're starting to, and to accommodate enslavers, that if we're starting to make some territory to say there's slavery is outlawed, we're also going to include this accommodation of this fugitive slave clause. So all of that is context for the fears for the delegates coming into the Constitutional Convention. So there's developing, so there's slave societies in the North. There's societies with slaves in the North, and there's slave societies in the South, meaning that in the South, their whole economic and social structure is around what they call the peculiar institution of slavery. So in the northern states, there are slaves and societies with slaves, but it's not the central support for their economic life and their social life. So there's that division already, and the southern delegates see this emancipation movement happening in the states, or in the northern states. So they're fearful that going into this meeting, that it's remarkable the meeting's even happening, they're worried that their slave society is going to be threatened by any decisions that this body of men is going to make. So there's So that's context for the fears going in. So part of civil dialogue is having structured conversations when you're trying to address anything that could be a hard feeling or a hard topic to address. So the delegates in the Constitutional Convention, one of the first items of business was to establish rules for conducting their business. So it's really following the tradition of Robert's Rules of Order, but there were other rules that they included, including You can't speak to the person next to you. You have to pay attention to the speaker. You can't walk if somebody is speaking to an issue, they're speaking to the president. You can't walk in front of them and be a distraction. So these rules are really helpful for teachers in classrooms because they can make the same kind of rules around respect and respectful communication. Additionally, they agreed to create committees that anytime there would be an issue that was too difficult, then they would create a committee and they would intentionally choose representatives from different states, especially North and South, to hash out the problem and to bring it back. Also that you were allowed to speak on the same issue twice. So part of this is allowing the space for their disagreements and to be able to work things out across their differences. So let's imagine that just the northern states are saying we're starting to end slavery, and we don't want the southern states to influence this, so we're just going to set up our rules in a way that they can't really have a voice. So you can imagine that the southern states aren't going to agree to any agreement that is made under those kinds of conditions. So there has to be rules in a way that makes the space for them to work out their issues. I'm just going to briefly summarize what happened for the Great Compromise because it provides context, and then I'm going to break down what are the accommodations around slavery that they made in order to achieve the agreement of creating the Constitutional Convention. So for the Great Compromise, the proposed plan was that there would be two representation in Congress would have two houses. So several of the states had what were called unicameral legislatures, and Pennsylvania was looked to as an example of this. And so the proposal was to have two houses because there were a lot of issues in Pennsylvania around the unicameral legislature. So, and that both houses would be based on population. So the states that had that were small and didn't have a high population, they didn't like this idea because it would mean that they wouldn't have as much of a voice in Congress. And so they didn't like it. And so they said, let's just do what we were doing under the Articles of Confederation, which is that every state has one equal vote. And so they talked about this for 2.5 months. I can't convey how big of a deal this was to them, when to us it just seems like it's not a big deal. So ultimately, the Great Compromise was that the upper house would have equal votes among the states and the lower house would be based on population, which is why we have the House of Representatives and the Senate the way it is. So after they decide that the lower house would be based on population, well, this brings up a question of how do we count everybody in the states, because some of the people in the states are enslaved. So how are we going to count them? What they ultimately decide is, with the 3/5 clause, was to count for every 5 free people, then they would count 3 enslaved people. So another point that I want to make is that in the convention, so leading up to the revolutionary period for constitution making was like during the war. And at the time of the convention, they weren't very revolutionary. They're just using precedents in order to make their agreements. So the precedent that they draw from, there was a proposal earlier under the Articles of Confederation that the 3/5 figure was the outgrowth of a debate that had taken place within the Continental Congress in 1783. The Articles of Confederation had appointed taxes not according to population, but according to land values. The states consistently undervalued their land in order to reduce their tax burden. To rectify the situation, a special committee recommended apportioning taxes by population. The Continental Congress debated the ratio of slaves to free persons at great length. Northerners favored a 4-to-3 ratio, while Southerners favored a 2-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio. Finally, James Madison suggested a compromise, a 5-to-3 ratio. All but 2 states, New Hampshire and Rhode Island, approved this recommendation, but because the Articles of Confederation required unanimous agreement, the proposal was defeated. When Constitutional Convention met in 1787, it adopted Madison's earlier suggestion. So this is not something that they come up with. They're taking precedence from other places, and so drawing on this ratio. And that now the way that they're calculating taxes and representation in Congress is applying this 3-to-5 ratio. So that's one precedent that they draw from. The other precedent, or another precedent, is in debating or what would become the Fugitive Slave Clause. So they reference the decision in the the Northwest Territory, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, with that ending slavery in the Northwest Territory, but also including a fugitive slave clause. That happens it happens in July 1787 in Congress when the Constitutional Convention is happening. So a month later, they decide on this fugitive slave clause within the Constitution. And so how this happens is because a guy named Charles Pinckney, we'll hear more about him, and he has a cousin named Charles Pinckney, so we'll double hear more about him. So he comes to the convention with his plan of the things that he wants to make sure he is included in, whatever thing that they create. So he came with this plan to include a fugitive slave clause. So this clause was driven by Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, who brought his own plan to the Constitutional Convention. In April of 1787, on the eve of the convention, the Charles Morning Post published an advertisement for Cudjoe, a 35-year-old escapee, along with 7 others who had escaped from St. Andrew's Plantation and had once been owned by Charles Pinckney's father. At the convention, Pinckney argued for fugitive slaves and servants, like Cudjoe and his party, to be delivered up like criminals. So Pinckney is advocating for this. The Congress just included this fugitive slave clause, voted on it a month before, so it's not a hard inclusion for them to also include a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. So the last accommodation or compromise around slavery in the Constitutional Convention is around the slave importation or the importation of slaves. So what this was that the delegates in convention were able to achieve consensus around how to count enslaved people for taxes and representation. They agreed to the fugitive slave provision. The last point of consensus over the divisive issue of slavery would be over how to tax the transatlantic slave trade, known as the importation of slaves. So what power would the national government have over what is called the importation of slaves? Could it end this form of trafficking of persons? Could the national government tax kidnapped slaves, treating them like other imported commodities? So while abolitionism was only emerging, the first abolitionist society established in Philadelphia was in 1775. Many people at the time criticized the transatlantic slave trade, also known as Middle Passage. Middle Passage took about 7 weeks. Captured slaves were crammed into spaces sometimes less than 5 feet high, and illness spread rapidly with the vomit, mucus, and feces and other fluids. So the death rate was very high, and about 25% in the 18th century, 25% of the captured slaves die in passage. So by the time they arrive in North America, 25% of the boats of the people on the boats have died. So generally in society, it was not considered inhumane to hold someone in slavery. It was accepted to inflict some violence to manage behavior, but there were boundaries to acceptable treatment. So the slave trade generally crossed those boundaries for people. So there's a lot of, in society, criticism of the slave importation, the practice of importing slaves. So I'm going to share some excerpts from the debate in the Constitutional Convention when they're deciding on can they tax the importation of slaves. So I've selected these excerpts to illustrate how some delegates, while they're debating this particular topic of like taxing importation of slaves, they're using it as a jumping off point to express their views about slavery in some cases, but also to express what the national government, what they think the national government can and can't do around this practice. So John Rutledge of South Carolina said that religion and humanity had nothing to do with the question of slavery in general, but they're specifically talking about the slave importation. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. The true question at present is whether the southern states shall or shall not be parties to the Union. So this is from Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut. He was part of the delegation that helped to come up with a great compromise. And so the Connecticut delegation is really trying to think in an accommodating way. So he says, let every state import what it pleases. The morality or wisdom of slavery are considerations belonging to the states themselves. The old Confederation had not meddled with this point, and he did not see how any greater necessity for bringing it with the policy of the new one. Old Confederation meaning under the Articles of Confederation, they're considering creating this new constitution. So he says, not what we did under our last government, so let's not mess with it under our new government. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina says, South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade. If the states be all left at liberty on this subject, South Carolina may perhaps by degrees do of herself what is wished. So saying that if don't let the national government tell South Carolina what to do, if you don't tell us what to do, maybe we're going to end the importation of slaves, similar to what other states have done, but don't tell us to do it, not to do it, because the plan's not going to be adopted back home in South Carolina. Roger Sherman, who's also part of that Connecticut delegation that brokered the Great Compromise, he says he disapproved of the slave trade, yet as the states were now possessed of the right to import slaves as the public good did not require it to be taken from them, and as it was expedient to have a few objections as possible to the proposed scheme of government, he thought it best to leave the matters as we find it. He observed that the abolition of slavery seemed to be going on in the U.S. and that the good sense of the several states would probably by degrees complete it. So he's referencing this gradual emancipation in the northern states. He urged on the convention the necessity of dispatching its business. Dispatching its business meaning let's make a plan to solve our national issues, and let's not worry about slavery right now because it looks like eventually it's going to end on its own without any political will spent on it. So this one is interesting because George Mason is a slave owner himself. He's from Virginia. He's also the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which has similar language. It was Jefferson used it to write the Declaration of Independence, so it has this universal language about the rights of humans. So it says, every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this one. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. He thought that the general government, meaning the national government, should have the power to prevent the increase of slavery. So he's advocating with this new plan that the general government should limit slavery in some way. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina says, if the southern states were let alone, they will probably of themselves stop importations. He would himself, as a citizen of South Carolina, vote for it. An attempt to take away the right as proposed will produce serious objections to the Constitution, which he wished to see adopted. So he's referencing that after they produce their draft of the Constitution, it has to go back to the states for that ratification. So he's saying, maybe I'm okay with ending slavery, which he's probably not, yeah, I can't take it back home, and it's not going to get anywhere if it has any limits on slavery. So his cousin also responds, he says, he declared it to be his firm opinion that if himself and all his colleagues were to sign the Constitution and use their personal influence, it would be of no avail toward obtaining the assent of their constituents. South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. So he's making the same point as his cousin. So ultimately, they create a plan, and which is remarkable for the time that they were able to come up with a consensus when they had such divergent issues and views on what the national government should do. So, but this is really disappointing to us that we know that this shared power between the states and the national government, and that the southern states were wanting to continue the practice of slavery. We know that that leads to the Civil War. So at the time of the Revolution, there's kind of this sentiment influenced by this rights rhetoric of this idea of equality, when they're starting to realize kind of the hypocrisy of owning slaves, while at the same time we're talking about rights. But by the time of the Civil War, the southern states are making a very different argument, where they're arguing that slavery is a positive good, that it's good for the slaves, that they're enslaved because they have Christianity, and we pay for their food, and we protect them. So, and remember back to the common belief that Franklin was realizing was not the belief that he wanted or that he recognized, that they don't recognize that African Americans have the same mental capacity and the same capacity for character. So they need to be taken care of, is the argument that the southern states are making. So these divergent views eventually lead to the Civil War, and the Civil War is the bloodiest war in American history. To not end on that, we're going to talk about reconciliation, the approach, Abraham Lincoln's reconciliation approach. So I drew on Carl's definition of reconciliation from this morning. This is my capture of his definition of it. So this really describes well what Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was. It was an attempt to restore meaningful relationships between the North and the South, and to nurture the common good, the union of the states again, and to establish a future view in which all conflicting parties feel that they belong, that together we are all Americans, and that was his vision. So the way that Lincoln talked about this, so he gives his second inaugural address. The 13th Amendment has already passed. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States. So Lincoln, with the Emancipation Proclamation, freed slaves in rebelling states, but it's just a military action, and it's just temporary for the conflict. In order to end slavery, then they need a constitutional amendment. So they passed the 13th Amendment, and at the time, there's no southern states in Congress because they're not admitted back to the Union, so it's a lot easier to pass the 13th Amendment. So the war is coming to a close, but it's not the end when he gives this second inaugural address. So people are really hurting from the tragedy of war. About 1 in 3 Americans have died. So we can imagine that almost every family has lost somebody close to them. So when it looks like, when they know that the war is coming to an end, a lot of people want Lincoln to punish the South for this tragedy that the South has brought upon them as their perspective. So Lincoln's speech is a surprise to the audience, that they don't expect what he's going to say. So he uses this language, he says, with malice toward none and with charity for all. So he says, one theme that Lincoln emphasizes in his second inaugural is that with malice toward none, the first step in reconciliation is a personal choice to withhold hate, to see each other in our American natural rights tradition of deserving of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Instead of inflicting more pain to avenge the pain suffered from war, Lincoln promoted a conscious decision to emphasize healing. And then he also promotes this idea of inclusivity, charity for all. He says that all dreaded the war, all sought to avert it, all knew that that slavery caused it, and that both read the same Bible, and that all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and among all of our nations, all of our nation. So this policy or mindset of reconciliation influences the surrender at that ended the Civil War. So at Appomattox Courthouse. So they allow the Southerners who are surrendering. They can take, the officers are allowed to keep their arms. The rank and file members throw their guns into a pile. They're allowed to take their horses, and they're allowed to go home. And Lee says, do you have any food? We are starving. And we're not able to feed the Union prisoners of war that we have. So in this policy influenced by Lincoln, then they offer the food that they have and provide it for them. So what is tragic is that Lincoln gets assassinated. So he gives in his last speech, here, I didn't want to go there yet. So in his last speech, Lincoln gives the speech out a window of the White House. And he says that in his last speech, Lincoln advocated for giving the vote to, speaking of black men, whether they should get the vote. He says, to the very intelligent and to those who served our cause of soldiers. So there's not this idea of this universal or all black men receiving the right to vote yet, which is the 15th Amendment. So that hasn't happened yet. So a guy named John Wilkes Booth is in the audience, and he says, that means, and he uses the N-word, which I will not. He says, that means the N-word citizenship. Now, by God, I will put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make. So Lincoln is killed because of his desire to expand the right to vote to black men. So what's really tragic is that one of the great what-ifs of history is that what if Lincoln wasn't killed? That if we had continued on this policy of reconciliation for the South, how would our history ended up differently? We have no way to know. But he did die, and then his vice president, Andrew Johnson, became president, and he was a Southern sympathizer, and he undid a lot of that reconciliation policy that Lincoln had established. And then in 1877, one of the great turning points in American history was that a contested presidential election went to the House of Representatives. And this is called the Bargain of 1877. Southern representatives agreed to let the Northern candidate become the president if federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. This left the formerly enslaved vulnerable to racially motivated violence and ushered in an era of domestic terrorism in the South. So this is where I will end on. So W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, and he has much of his work focused on telling the story of Reconstruction. So he said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. And it's because of this that we work for racial healing and why our work continues today. So thank you. I'm happy to answer or respond to any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much. You went fairly quickly over it right after the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
You said the southern states weren't represented.
Oh, mm-hmm.
How long was how long did that last?
It's a gradual process. So by the it's within 5 to 10 years. Then the southern states, all the southern states, are back in the Union and are part of Congress. So when Black men get the right to vote, then there's a lot of men of color who are elected to public office. So 2,000 in local and public office. There's a member of Congress. The Louisiana governor is a Black man. And so there's that brief moment. But then as the Southerners get power again, then they intimidate them and limit their constitutional right to vote. So I don't know the numbers, but like generally I think it's like 5 to 10 years in that process. Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of connecting this in my head with what Sarah talked about earlier, with so much of a physical reaction to these kinds of things and stemming from our nervous systems and also from our values and our identity. Are there any historical clues or records about how delegates back in that day, they seemed to be fairly good at working through those things and being able to have constructive conversations and compromising or collaborating on these things? Are there any historical clues about how they did that?
So you're asking specifically about the delegates in the Constitutional Convention and how they work through it? I don't know if, like, there's not a lot of record of like their emotional response. That's not really a thing that people are writing down for us. Where I thought you were going, if I may respond to that, about the trauma for the former slaves, that there's a famous political cartoon. It's in the Museum of the African American, for the, I can't remember the title of the museum now that we're in front, but on the National Mall, Museum of the African American Museum of History and Culture. So this is included, but this like political cartoon is everywhere. So it's two figures of KKK members that are overhanging to a Black man and a Black woman, and there's a sign in front of them that says that it's worse than slavery. So the trauma, like as I briefly mentioned, under slavery, they're considered human property, and they can have violence, use violence to extract labor from them. But they're also viewed as an investment, so they're not going to be hurt in a way so much that they can't work. But when they're not slaves anymore, then there's not that protection. And the legal system isn't providing protection. So really anybody can like murder any person of color and likely get away with it. So the emotional trauma of the vulnerability of at any time, you could be murdered without cause, your family could be murdered without cause, then all of that, trauma that we talked about earlier, that just represents like how, millions of people are feeling at the time. And for generations, like the intergenerational trauma. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, if not, then thanks, Sarah, or Alicia, excuse me. We appreciate your attendance here today, and for some of you, your resilience in staying throughout the day. I hope it has been as rewarding for you as it has been for me. And we're grateful to the people who have presented. Again, I've personally learned a great deal from you, and I'm grateful. And I think the people who have attended have been well rewarded for what we have done. So we'll see you next year.